These are the most disturbing Family Guy episodes. Let's get started with our first one. So there's this Family Guy episode called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. And honestly, it's probably the most messed up thing the show ever did. We're talking about serious domestic violence here. This episode shows Quagmire's sister, Brenda, getting beaten by her boyfriend Jeff, and it gets really dark really fast. Everything starts when Quagmire almost kills himself in a weird accident and ends up in the hospital. His sister Brenda shows up with her boyfriend Jeff, and you can tell something's wrong immediately. Jeff is a complete psycho who treats Brenda like garbage right in front of everyone. He won't even let her hug her own brother without getting angry. The guy screams at her for literally nothing and acts like he owns her. What makes this so disturbing is how real it feels. Jeff beats her constantly. The neighbors hear him yelling at her through the walls every night. He controls everything she does, who she talks to, where she works, even what clothes she can wear. When Lois tries to take Brenda out for lunch, you see how messed up Brenda's become. She can't even close a menu at a restaurant without panicking that she's doing something wrong. The abuse just keeps getting worse throughout the episode. Jeff punches Brenda so hard she has to wear sunglasses to hide her black eyes. He breaks her finger and then jokes about it, saying it fell down the stairs. But the mental abuse is just as bad. He tells her she's worthless, makes her work over 100 hours a week, and cuts her off from any friends or family. Brenda's so brainwashed, she actually defends him, saying he's sweet and hits her softly when they're alone. It's sick. The show doesn't hold back on showing Jeff's manipulation tactics either. He isolates Brenda from everyone who might help her, making her completely dependent on him. He destroys her self-esteem by constantly telling her she's fat, ugly, and stupid. When she tries to defend herself or explain his behavior to others, she sounds completely delusional, because that's what abuse does to people. It warps their reality. There's this really disturbing scene where Jeff demands Brenda take off her nightgown so he can draw her while he screams at her about money. It's clearly sexual abuse on top of everything else, but the show handles it in a way that makes you understand what's happening without being exploitative about it. The whole episode feels like watching a real domestic violence situation unfold, which is what makes it so uncomfortable. Things get really bad when the family tries an intervention. Quagmire gets everyone together to tell Brenda she needs to leave Jeff. The intervention scene is heartbreaking because Quagmire basically begs his sister to come back to him. He says the sister he grew up with doesn't exist anymore, and she's just become a punching bag. He reads this emotional letter about how much he loves her and wants her back. But instead of leaving Jeff, Brenda drops a bombshell she's marrying him because she's pregnant. Now there's going to be a baby stuck in this nightmare too. The pregnancy announcement is where the episode gets even darker. Jeff makes it clear he doesn't want the baby and is only marrying Brenda because he knocked her up. He suggests naming the baby Slappy or Bruisey, which shows he's already planning to abuse the kid. This adds another layer of horror because now an innocent child is going to grow up in this violent household. That's when Quagmire, Peter, and Joe lose it. They're so sick of watching Brenda get beaten that they decide to murder Jeff. They trick him into going on a fake hunting trip, planning to kill him in the woods. But Jeff figures out what's happening and flips the script on them. He takes Quagmire hostage and is about to shoot him. The whole murder plot shows how domestic violence affects everyone around the victim. These guys are normally law-abiding citizens, but they're driven to commit murder because they feel helpless watching someone they care about get destroyed. Joe's a cop, and even he's willing to break the law because he knows the system won't protect Brenda. Here's where it gets crazy. Jeff's about to execute Quagmire when Quagmire dares him to put the gun down and fight like a man. Jeff thinks he can easily beat up skinny Quagmire, so he agrees. But here's the twisted part. Quagmire has been choking himself his whole life, so his neck is super strong. When Jeff tries to strangle him, it doesn't work. Quagmire breaks free and runs Jeff over with a truck, killing him. The fight scene is brutal and realistic. There's no cartoon violence here, it's just two men trying to kill each other. When Quagmire finally wins, there's no celebration or relief. It's just grim and necessary. The show doesn't glorify the violence at all. After Jeff's dead, they have to cover it up. They write a fake note saying Jeff left town, but even the note is threatening. It warns Brenda that if she tells anyone what really happened, Jeff will come back and murder her and calls her garbage. So even dead, this guy is still terrorizing her. The fake note also includes weird random stuff like loving grape ape, which shows how the guys are struggling to make it sound authentic while dealing with having just committed murder. The ending is really messed up because Brenda doesn't feel free, she just feels lost. She's been abused for so long she doesn't know how to function without someone controlling her. The episode ends with her crying, not from relief but from confusion. That's the really dark part. The trauma stays with you. This episode was huge for Family Guy because it showed they could tackle serious stuff without making jokes about everything. It doesn't sugarcoat domestic violence at all. It shows how abusers destroy their victims mentally, how the system fails women in danger, and how sometimes good people do terrible things when they feel there's no other choice. The really uncomfortable part is that Joe straight up tells them the cops can't help until Jeff actually kills Brenda. This reflects the real problem with how domestic violence cases are handled. By the time the law gets involved, it's often too late. The episode criticizes a system that protects abusers more than victims. What makes Screams of Silence so dark is that it suggests sometimes violence is the only way to stop an abuser. Whether you think that's right or wrong, this episode shows the ugly reality of domestic violence and how it affects everyone around it. It's disturbing, controversial, and definitely one of the darkest things Family Guy ever put on TV. The fact that they had to kill someone to save Brenda says something really dark about how our society handles these situations. Family Guy went from exposing brutal abuse in Screams of Silence to suddenly killing off Brian in Life of Brian. You know how some TV shows kill off characters and you kind of see it coming? One minute Brian's playing street hockey with Stewie, and the next minute he's roadkill. The episode starts with typical Stewie and Brian time travel nonsense. They mess up history by giving guns to Native Americans in colonial times, which leads to Native Americans taking over America instead of white people. It's actually pretty funny seeing this alternate timeline where everything's reversed. Native Americans have casinos everywhere, and their music dominates the radio with this repetitive chanting song that's been #1 for 0 weeks straight. The whole alternate reality thing shows what would happen if colonization went the other way. You see, Native Americans running hospitals, having their own medical system, and basically being in charge of everything. Meanwhile, white people are the ones getting discriminated against and pushed around. It's dark social commentary wrapped up in their usual absurd humor. After they restore the timeline, Stewie makes this dramatic decision to destroy his time machine completely. He's sick of nearly dying every time they use it, so he takes a sledgehammer to the whole thing and dumps it at the junkyard. The time machine has been his greatest invention, but he's willing to give it up for safety. This decision seems smart at the time, but it becomes the worst mistake of his life. While they're at the junkyard, they spot this perfectly good street hockey net that someone tossed out. Brian gets excited about having a new hobby now that they're done with time travel. He's talking about getting fresh air and exercise instead of being cooped up inside working on inventions all day. The whole thing feels like a fresh start for both of them. They set up the net in their front yard and start playing. The game itself is pretty typical Brian and Stewie stuff. They're competitive but having fun, trash-talking each other in their usual way. Stewie makes jokes about only letting babies win, while Brian goes inside to get his knee pads. Everything feels normal and relaxed, just two friends enjoying themselves on a beautiful day. Then it happens. Brian goes inside to grab his knee pads, and as he's walking back out to continue playing, a car comes flying down their street way too fast. Stewie screams, "Brian, look out!" But there's no time to react. The car slams into Brian at full speed and keeps driving without even stopping. The driver doesn't even slow down, just hits a dog and speeds away like nothing happened. What makes this scene so disturbing is how real it feels. Brian doesn't bounce back up like in typical cartoon violence. He's seriously hurt, bleeding everywhere, and clearly dying. Stewie's screaming and trying to help while the family rushes outside. You can see the panic in everyone's eyes because they know this is bad. The family scrambles to get Brian help, loading him into a car and rushing him to the veterinarian as fast as possible. The whole scene feels desperate and chaotic, like a real emergency. At the vet's office, they're all sitting in that horrible waiting room where families get bad news. The veterinarian comes out looking grim, and you know what's coming before he even speaks. He delivers the devastating news that Brian's injuries are too severe to save him. His bones are crushed, his internal organs are damaged, and there's nothing modern veterinary medicine can do. He tells the family to say their goodbyes because Brian doesn't have long. This hits like a punch to the gut because you realize the show is actually going through with this. Brian's death scene is absolutely brutal and feels nothing like typical Family Guy. He's hooked up to machines in this sterile vet office, barely conscious but trying to communicate with his family one last time. He's struggling to speak, clearly in pain, but he manages to tell them they gave him a wonderful life and that he loves them all. His voice is weak, and you can tell every word is an effort. When the heart monitor flatlines, the silence is deafening. Peter completely breaks down, crying that Brian was his best friend and like a brother. Lois is sobbing, the kids are devastated, and the whole family is destroyed by this loss. Right after Brian dies, Stewie has this horrible realization that destroys him psychologically. He could have saved Brian if he still had the time machine. Just hours earlier, he destroyed the one thing that could have prevented this tragedy. The irony is crushing. Stewie destroyed the time machine to keep them safe, but that decision directly led to Brian's death. Stewie desperately tries to rebuild the machine, frantically searching for the parts he needs. But when he contacts his supplier, Yusuf, he gets devastating news. The guy who made titanium capacitors drew a doodle of Muhammad while talking on the phone, not even on purpose, just absent-mindedly, and got murdered for it. Without those specific parts, it's impossible to build a functioning time machine. Brian is gone forever. The funeral scene shows the real impact of losing Brian on the entire community. Peter gives this heartbreaking speech about losing his best friend, talking about how Brian was like a brother to him and how he'll spend the rest of his life missing him. You see grown men crying, which almost never happens in Family Guy. There's this weird moment at the funeral where this random black woman keeps hitting Joe with her purse, thinking he's supposed to solve Brian's death like it's a murder case. She keeps yelling about bringing the killer to justice and making sure Brian didn't die for nothing. It's both absurd and heartbreaking because she clearly cares more about a dog she never met than some people care about actual humans. A whole month passes and the family is still struggling with grief. Peter keeps almost serving Brian food out of habit. Chris keeps getting stuck in the doggy door because he's trying to fill the void Brian left. The house feels empty, without Brian's intellectual conversations and his role as the family's moral compass. Lois finally suggests getting a new dog to help them heal, which brings them to the pet store. That's when they meet Vinny, a talking dog with a thick New Jersey accent and a completely different personality from Brian. Where Brian was intellectual and sophisticated, Vinny is street smart and crude. He talks about banging broads and makes Italian-American jokes. Peter immediately connects with him, because Vinny's more like a regular guy than Brian ever was. Vinny quickly integrates into the family in ways that both help and hurt. He offers to cook dinner for Lois, which Brian never did. He becomes Peter's drinking buddy at the Drunken Clam, filling that social role Brian never really occupied. But his presence also highlights everything the family lost when Brian died. Stewie initially hates Vinny and sees him as a cheap replacement for Brian. He tries to kill Vinny by telling him tragic news about Italian Americans, hoping to give him a heart attack. Stewie feeds him stories about kids getting killed by falling pianos and other horrible fates befalling Italian families. But Chris ruins the plan by calling Stewie names, which actually makes Vinny happy instead of sad. The turning point comes when Vinny finds Stewie crying alone. Instead of ignoring it or making jokes, Vinny sits down and actually talks to the kid about grief and loss. He explains how his previous owner Leo died in this absurd yoga accident, where his ball sack split in half during the first pose. It was such a weird death that it got covered on Dateline as a whole news story. Vinny's story about Leo helps Stewie understand that everyone deals with loss, and that finding new people to care about doesn't mean forgetting the ones you lost. Vinny explains that when he saw the Griffin family at the pet store, he recognized that they were going through the same feelings of loss that he experienced when Leo died. The episode ends with Vinny staying in Stewie's room for the night, showing that their bond is starting to develop. But it's not the same relationship Stewie had with Brian. It's something completely different. Vinny can't replace Brian's role as Stewie's intellectual equal and time travel partner. What made Life of Brian so dark was how it handled death realistically. Brian had been a core character since day one, representing the voice of reason in the Griffin household. Killing him off changed the entire show dynamic permanently and showed that nobody was safe from getting killed off. The episode proved that sometimes bad things happen for absolutely no good reason, and even beloved characters can die in the most mundane ways possible. After killing Brian in Life of Brian with real tragedy, Family Guy switched to Seahorse Seashell Party, where the shock came from Meg finally standing up to her family. Sometimes the worst Family Guy episodes are the ones that hit too close to home. Seahorse Seashell Party takes place during a hurricane when the Griffin family gets trapped inside together, and what starts as typical family boredom turns into Meg having a complete mental breakdown where she finally tells everyone exactly what kind of people they really are. The whole thing starts during Hurricane Flozell, that forces the Griffin family to stay inside their house for 36 hours. They're stuck together with no TV, no internet, nothing to do but interact with each other. While this is happening, Brian decides to take magic mushrooms to pass the time, which sends him on this terrifying drug trip with hallucinations and nightmares throughout the episode. The family tries to entertain themselves with games like charades, but they're all getting on each other's nerves. Peter does his annoying dad noises routine where he just makes gross sounds for several minutes. Then they play this finger gun game where they pretend to shoot each other, but when Meg tries to join in, Peter immediately shuts her down, saying nobody wants to get finger banged by her. That's when something snaps in Meg. She's had enough of being treated like garbage by her own family. Instead of just taking it like she usually does, Meg explodes and tells everyone exactly what she thinks of them. And she doesn't hold back at all. First, she goes after Chris for being a terrible brother. She tears into him about how he's supposed to be on her side, but instead, he treats her like he hates her. Meg points out that Chris constantly says hurtful things to her and joins in on all the family bullying. She asks him how he'd feel if she started calling him a fat, zitty loser who has no friends and smells like an old woman who has birds for pets. Chris is completely shocked because nobody's ever called him out like this before. Then Meg turns her attention to Lois, and this is where things get really dark. She calls out Lois for being a hypocrite who acts like a moral authority while having this history of shoplifting, drug addiction, porn, and sleeping around with celebrities. But the worst part is when Meg gets into the psychological damage Lois has caused her. Meg tells Lois that from the moment she was born, she had to trust her mother completely. She needed Lois to protect her and guide her through life. Instead, Lois spent 17 years on a mission to destroy something that you killed a long time ago. Meg says that when she turns 18, she doesn't know if she ever wants to see Lois again. This breaks Lois completely. She starts crying and admits she's been a terrible mother. But Meg's not done. She goes after Peter next, and she absolutely destroys him. She calls him a fat, lazy, abusive, a blue-collar Irish Catholic dad who drinks way too much and barely makes enough money to support his family. She tells him he's lived half his life with nothing to show for it except his kids, and even they turned out to be disasters. Meg points out that Peter is completely selfish and irresponsible. She brings up how he literally shoves her face in his butt and farts on her, saying if anyone from the outside world saw how he treats her, he'd be in jail. She calls him a total and complete embarrassment in every possible way, and a waste of a man. The family completely falls apart after Meg's breakdown. Everyone starts attacking each other instead of ganging up on Meg like they usually do. Peter and Lois get into this huge fight about everything from food to sex. Chris joins in complaining about his mother's cooking and how Peter eats all the yogurt. The whole family structure collapses without Meg as their scapegoat. Peter gets so upset he runs away and hides in the closet with the shoes, crying that he doesn't deserve better. The family is in complete chaos, yelling at each other and falling apart. This is when Meg has this horrible realization about her role in the family. Brian finds Meg and tells her it was cool how she finally stood up for herself. But Meg realizes that the family literally cannot function without someone to abuse. She figures out that maybe her role is to be the lightning rod that absorbs all the family's dysfunction so they don't have to turn on each other. Meanwhile, throughout all this family drama, Brian is having the worst drug trip of his life. He's seeing terrifying hallucinations of his family members as monsters, devils, singing nursery rhymes, and all kinds of nightmarish visions. Stewie has to babysit him through the whole experience, which adds this surreal layer to an already intense episode. So Meg does something that's either incredibly noble or incredibly depressing. She takes it all back. She goes to her family and apologizes for everything she said. She tells them they're all amazing and that she was wrong to blame them for her problems. She says it was all her fault and takes responsibility for the entire breakdown. The family immediately goes back to normal, with Peter feeling better about himself and everyone happy to have their punching bag back. Meg accepts being called a bitch by her own father and agrees with him that, yes, she is exactly that. The really disturbing part is that Meg makes this conscious choice to sacrifice her own mental health for the family's stability. She becomes a martyr who absorbs all their toxicity so they can function. Brian tells her she might be the strongest person in the house, but you have to wonder if she's actually the most damaged. This episode shows how abusive family dynamics really work. Meg serves a specific function as the scapegoat who allows everyone else to feel better about themselves. When she stops playing that role, the entire family system breaks down because they need someone to blame for all their problems. The episode ends with Stewie doing a parody of those very special episode PSAs about drug use, which is darkly funny considering the real issue was never Brian's mushroom trip, but the family's psychological abuse of their own daughter. The long-term impact was huge because it showed that Family Guy understood exactly how toxic the Griffin family dynamic was. Meg was being psychologically destroyed, and they made it clear that this was intentional. The episode basically said that some families are so broken they need a victim to function, and that victim has to choose between their own sanity and keeping the family together. That's it for today. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you in the next one.